Over the last 20 years of this radio show, I've relied on three people to be sort of my eyes and ears on the whole world. Dexter Filkins of The New Yorker, John Burns, retired from the New York Times now, and my next guest, Robert Kaplan, who for 3 decades has traveled the globe incessantly, beginning in 1990 and written about it, Soldiers of God from that year. But you've heard me talk to him in the past about his wonderful books, Hog Pilot, Blue Water Grunts, Imperial Grunts, Eastward Towards Tartary. Most recently, at the end of last year, I listened to a book of his, Asia's Cauldron, about the South China Sea, and I booked him. And it's very, very advantageous because the Eurasia Group, with whom he is affiliated, has put out a brand new study this morning. Robert Kaplan, Happy New Year, Happy New Decade, and welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Happy New Year, Hugh. It's great to be here with you.
I've got to begin, even though Soleimani's killing is a major headline, I'm going to get to that, but I wanted to talk to you about Asia's Cauldron. And one of the things about strategy is the big issues don't change. And the big issue in that book with China and its adversaries and competitors in the South China Sea, I believe it's 4 years old. How much has changed since you finished that very important book about the South China Sea, Robert Kaplan?
Actually, the book is 6 years old, Hugh. It came out in 2014, in early 2014. What's changed is not much in the South China Sea itself. What has changed is the entire context of the U.S.-China relationship. The U.S.-China relationship has now gone into decoupling of supply chains, into a real ideological conflict between the U.S. and China. China's gone from a very benign, benevolent, collegial, authoritarian regime with which Washington could live with to a much more hard-edged, personality cult-driven, one-man show, so that China has no friends in Washington anymore. So everything has gotten harder. And trade, of course, has come to the forefront. So, and because the general context of the U.S.-China relationship is poisoned, the South China Sea is really become more of a focal point of it. And since 2014, since I published that book, China has been building islands, reclaiming islands, putting in missile batteries, putting down runway strips, etc., so that China's ability to gradually push the U.S. Navy and Air Force out of the South China Sea area has only increased in the past 6 years.
You know, Robert, as I read that, and I have been recommending it to everyone, I learned more about Malaysia, for example, than I ever knew. I got a glimpse of Filipino history that I had never understood. I understood Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, but not to the degree that Asia's Cauldron brought forth to me. But I kept thinking, I knew it was a few years old. I kept thinking, President Xi is not fully understood yet or accounted for, and the transition, the hoped-for democratization of the authoritarian capitalist regime is not going to happen. And I don't think there's any promise of it happening.
No. The big mistake that the Washington power elite made was that they assumed that as China got richer and more middle class, it would become more liberal. In the old-fashioned definition of liberalism. What's happened is the reverse. As China has gotten richer and has expanded and enlarged its middle class, the regime has become more illiberal, more authoritarian than before, and that has a lot to do with the evolution of technology. The cyber-digital age is more friendly to authoritarian systems than to democratic ones because of the way that you can bend the truth and create false facts in a digital cyber environment that you could not do as much in a print and typewriter age.
You know, that is a central and important observation. Interestingly enough, Robert Kaplan, last night at the Golden Globes, Ricky Gervais, the British comedian, made a point completely on point with what you just said. I want to play it for people about multinational corporations and with whom they deal, including those in the entertainment industry. Cut number 24.
a superb drama about the importance of dignity and doing the right thing, made by a company that runs sweatshops in China. So, well, you say you're woke, but the companies you work for, I mean, unbelievable. Apple, Amazon, Disney. If ISIS started a streaming service, you'd call your agent, wouldn't you? So, if you do win an award tonight, don't use it as a platform to make a political speech, right? You're in no position to lecture the public about anything. You know nothing about the real world. Most of you spent less time in school than Greta Thunberg. So, if you win, right, come up, accept your little award, thank your agent and your God.
You know, Robert Kaplan, I try to be humble about how much I don't know because I don't know a lot. That's why I read your books. But I think that was a very necessary rebuke to people who are cooperating with authoritarian regimes that are indeed doing malignant things, such as to the Uyghurs in China.
Yes, keep one thing in mind about the Uyghurs in China, which is that to us it's a humanitarian issue, but to the Chinese regime it's a strategic issue, because the only reason China is building a great navy and dominating the South China Sea, etc., which even though China has very little naval tradition going back 1,000 years, is because the Chinese now have the luxury to do so, and they have the luxury to do so because for the first time they are secure on land. And to become more secure on land in Western China, where they were the most insecure for centuries, they are repressing the Uyghurs. So the repression of the Uyghurs goes hand in hand with aggression in the South China Sea, China's naval expansion in the Indian Ocean. It's all part of a pattern.
Now, Robert Kaplan, I have been arguing over the course of the new year in a number of interviews, most recently with Acting Secretary of the Navy Thomas Modly on Friday, that America's central challenge for the next 50 years is China. It doesn't mean we have to be in a war. It doesn't mean it has to be a Cold War, but we have to be very candid about where we are, especially when it comes to naval forces. Do you think, and do you credit President Trump with this, that America is awake to that central competition now?
Yes. What's happened over the last 3 or 4 years is that, Washington's mindset has shifted from an anti-terrorist campaign in the greater Middle East to a great power competition between the U.S., China, with Russia is sort of an asterisk in that. And it is a Cold War, because we're competing on so many fronts, and yet neither side sees it in its self-interest to ever have a shooting war. So therefore, by default, it's a Cold War, though a very different one than the one with the former Soviet Union.
It seems to me also to be one that calls on our United States Navy to return not perhaps to the 600-ship Navy of Reagan's era, but certainly to a more robust present. Admiral Stavridis likes to say quantity has a qualitative value all its own. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that. Of course, the challenge with building the Navy from, say, 280-odd ships, which is around what we have now, to about 350, the challenge of that is budgetary, because ships are such high capital items. I mean, an aircraft carrier with all of the fighter jets on it is about $18 billion. A Los Angeles-class sub is about $4 billion. We're dealing with massive sums of money.
Absent any kind of effective response, though, do we not cede all of that part of the world? Or do the local powers, for example, your chapter on Vietnam and Asia's Cauldron, I just went to Vietnam this year, or last year, 2019, and was stunned by their productivity. Glad to read in your book that Da Nang will be hosting American ships, et cetera. But nevertheless, they are dwarfed by their neighbor, dwarfed.
Yeah, they're dwarfed, and, one thing to follow is that as supply chains decouple and Huawei technologies compete with American companies for the next 5G network, that a country like Vietnam, it's going to be really tough for it to choose to go whether with China's 5G or with our 5G. And Vietnam may have fought 17 or how many wars it's fought with China, but China is right next door. and we're half a world away. And that's something that Vietnam always has to keep in the forefront of its mind.
Let me turn specifically to the Eurasia Group has published this morning the new risks that approach in the decade. Number 3 is U.S.-China, and you just used that word, decoupling. Would you expand on that and how, for example, the average American ought to view decoupling?
Yeah, decoupling is very complex, and the greatest experts don't really know how it's going to play out. For the last 30 years, we've been in what we've called globalization. It's really just the first phase of globalization, which was about uniting the world, expanding middle classes, et cetera, et cetera. It was an era friendly to optimists. But we're now entering the second phase of globalization, which is more friendly to pessimists, where the world divides up. Supply chains are when a product, say the Apple iPhone, which many of us have, is actually manufactured and designed in several different countries. And that constitutes a supply chain. So that the U.S. and China have been interwoven in the same supply chains, like the Apple iPhone, which is actually produced in China to a large extent. But if we're entering a period of decoupling means that supply chains will separate out because the U.S. and China, for instance, do not trust each other, and they do not trust what they will put into their digital products. So that Apple may have to find someplace else other than China to produce iPhones at roughly the same price and quality. And China will have to design products and things that have no Western components in it. And you can just see how complex this gets.
Yeah, trade is not just trade, it's a strategic choice.
Exactly. And the more complex this gets, quality of items is going to suffer, and price will suffer. Things may become more expensive and less qualitatively good.
Now, Robert Kaplan, there is sort of an implicit hope in the West that India will bail us out here. In fact, in the Eurasia Group study number 5, India gets Modi-fied. Play on words of course, Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi. I don't know that we can place all of our eggs in the basket of India becoming the third great power. What say you?
Yeah, I agree. First of all, the U.S.-India partnership, which really we have to credit George W. Bush with, he really opened up India, occurred under a specific geopolitical context that no longer exists. That context was the U.S.-China rivalry was tame, it was about engagement, it was predictable, so that India could have, even though it was next to China, it could afford to align itself with the U.S. But as the U.S.-China rivalry becomes more hot, more unpredictable, more contentious, India may find that it will rediscover Gandhian, Nehruvian era neutralism, that it will play one power off against the other. And the Indians are very, especially under Modi, with his foreign minister, Jaishankar, who's a brilliant man, the Indians are very good at telling the Americans exactly what they want to hear, and then going to Vladivostok and signing deals with Russia and telling Putin exactly what he wants to hear, and the same with China. So that we should never think of India as in our pocket.
Good caution. I want to close now with the Shia crescendo, the 8th issue identified by Eurasia, and probably the one about which you and I have spent the most time, although we've also included Sunni extremism as well as Shia extremism here. Since we scheduled this interview, the United States has taken out the combatant terrorist Soleimani. Your reaction to that and your expectation for not just the next 72 hours or 8 weeks, but 10 years.
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm not a fan of President Trump, as you are. However, I believe that the assassination of Soleimani was the right thing to do. It was the right call. Because history is not just driven by vast impersonal forces of culture, geography, economy. It's also driven by important individuals. And Soleimani was like a man for all seasons. He was charismatic. He had command presence. He could talk grand strategy with the greatest experts, but he could tell a private or corporal how to load his gun, etc. He did not have a chain of command to contend with since he reported directly to Ayatollah Khamenei. Iran has a terrible conventional force. Its imperialism throughout the Middle East was driven by its proxy armies, and those proxy armies, the quality of them was basically dependent on one genius, Qasem Soleimani.
And let me ask at that point, and by the way, I disagree with the term assassination since I think he was a legitimate objective of war.
Okay,
but let me ask you the key question. Unremarked upon, it appears to me as though strategists are underplaying the disastrous consequences within Iran to remove the second most powerful person when an aging theocrat crank is at the top, and there are many people contending in a rat's nest for power, many of whom might have helped us identify where Soleimani was. I think we underplay that from the hints I've seen that we may have had help from within Iran to identify where he was.
I can't comment on that. All I know is that Iran had two things going for it. It had a functioning economy, and it had a genius as the head of its proxy forces in Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, etc. Its economy is cratering, and the genius is no longer alive. So that in terms of looking ahead 5 or 10 years, I think it will be positive. Of course, the next 72 hours, the next year, in fact, could be very unpredictable and tumultuous.
Robert Kaplan, it is always good to talk. You keep coming back. When's the next Kaplan book arrive?
On September 1st. It's called The Good American, the epic life and adventures of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian.
Well, how terrific.
Biography.
I look forward to that, and I look forward to talking to you often in the new decade. Robert Kaplan, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.